Hello friends, I am here today on behalf of Archibald. He is still on an expedition to confront one of the most dangerous monsters in the world. He gave me some material on the subject of plants. Plants represent an important group of living beings. Today they are responsible for supplying the atmosphere with oxygen. How did that happen? I have always been fascinated by the representations of plants from earlier times. Because as impressive as a dinosaur is, it is only when it is in the right environment that the impression is complete. Nevertheless, it is a lot more difficult to understand the history of plants than that of animals. Plants act like supporting actors, although without them the animals would never have been able to go ashore. To understand the history of plants and their relationship to us, it is necessary to go deep into the past, to the distant times of the Precambrian. In this distant past, archaebacteria of the Ascard group fused with alpha protobacteria, which from now on enabled them not only to tolerate oxygen, but also to use it effectively. A later fusion took place with spirochete-like bacteria, which developed into the locomotor system of the cells, the flagella. A paraphyletic group of similar organisms are the excavata. Because between the two main groups that exist today are both the group of later plants and animals. The main difference between the ancestors of plants and animals was that plants had two flagella while animal cells had only one. One speaks therefore of uniconts and biconts. The group of animals also includes fungi, which some mistakenly attribute to the plant kingdom, especially those who do not regard plants as living beings for ideological reasons. In the ancestral line of plants there are numerous branches that led to different unicellular organisms. The summaries were formed from the initial letters of the individual representatives and have nothing to do with Russian monarchs. Diatoms also belong to this kingdom. These are not plants in the strict sense, and as the name suggests, their cell wall is reinforced with silica. The group of Archaeoplastida now had a significant encounter, namely with the blue-green algae. These are by no means algae, nor they are blue. No, of course these are the well-known cyanobacteria, which were the first organisms to photosynthesize with chlorophyll by releasing oxygen. Oxygen was produced as a waste product, which at first didn't have a positive effect and led to the apocalyptic Huronian icing. The connection between the cells and the cyanobacteria led to new organelles, the chloroplasts. Although chlorophyll is actually responsible for the green color, there are also organisms of different colors such as red algae, in which carotenoids are responsible for the characteristic color. The group of Virida plant now includes the so-called green algae and plants. Green algae can be single or multicellular, and there are many families of them. The phragmoplastophytes differ from the rest of the groups through innovations in mitosis. In addition to plants, this group also includes candelabra algae. Finally, a billion years ago, the paths that led to plants on the one hand and candelabra algae on the other parted. There are indications that organisms tried to gain a foothold on the land as early as the Tonian. But finally there was an event that stopped this first shore leave, the Great Sturtian Glaciation. It is interesting that the closest relatives of modern plants are cold-loving algae, which suggests that modern plants originated sometime during the Cryogenian. They are grouped together to form the clade of embryophytes. Even so, the plants still needed some time to venture ashore. The first to make it 520 million years ago were moss-like organisms. During this time there was also the first significant division of the plant world. On the one hand there are the mosses, which have retained their original shape to this day, and the vascular plants, which of course did not have any vessels back then. The mosses formed the three groups that we still know today early on. There are also alternative perspectives. According to recent studies, the liverwort group is probably the oldest, followed by the deciduous moss and finally a group that branched out into hornworts and vascular plants. It is typical of all mosses that they spread with the help of spores. Fertilization takes place via female and male gametophytes, but asexual distribution is also possible. This combination was undoubtedly beneficial to the rapid spread of the mosses. When the mosses found their way to land, the bottom was raw stone. It probably took many generations of mosses to produce something like a first soil. Another way, which is still common today, is the cooperation of mosses with mushrooms, which can overgrow stones as so-called lichen. Not many genera have survived during the Paleophytic, which largely coincides with the Paleozoic. During the Mesophytic there is an ascent that culminates in the Lower Cretaceous. Since then, the biodiversity of the moss seems to be on the decline. The origin of the modern vascular plants is likely to be in the Upper Ordovician at that time. Very original groups such as the Horneophytes and Aglaophytes separated, which were still moss-like. The vascular plants, for their part, developed a system that made it possible to transport water from bottom to top and sugar from top to bottom. This innovation made it possible for later plants to become huge. But the first vascular plants, the Rhiniopsides, were still a long way from giant plants. The name of this group comes from the Scottish Rhynie chert, a fossil layer in which these plants were found. The approximately 5 cm high Cooksonia already existed in the Silurian, but soon other early vascular plants were added. They soon reached heights between 10 and 20 centimeters. The diligent preparatory work of generations of mosses certainly also allowed them to establish themselves in a first kind of soil. The roots did not reach deep, however, so many plants had branched above ground roots. These first vascular plants were granted for a short time. They reached their peak in the early Devonian, but by the end of the Devonian they had largely disappeared and only a handful of Rhiniophytes survived into the Middle Carboniferous. Even if a carpet of mosses and small vascular plants were greening the earth, the giants of that time were the Prototoxites, who are probably part of the mushroom kingdom. The Prototoxites could reach heights of more than 10 meters, so they were the trees of the Silurian. They finally disappear towards the end of the Devonian. What probably led to the demise of the Rhiniophytes was the competition from new, more progressive vascular plants. The first group, which should also have arisen in the Silurian, are the Lycophytes that still exist today. The first types such as the Zosterophyllophytes did not differ much in their appearance from the Rhiniophytes, but they were about 30 centimeters high. Asterxylon, which is already quite similar, was 40 centimeters high. The three present-day groups of the Lycophytes arose in the Silurian. However, these are rather tiny plants and no comparison to the giants that dominated the flora during the Carboniferous. Of course, I am talking about the Sigiaria and Lepidodendron trees. This is the first time a group of plants has created a new innovation, wood. Wood is known to consist of a polysaccharide called cellulose, which is related to starch. The storage of a polymeric phenolic compound, the so-called lignin, turns the cellulose into wood. Exactly, that's the stuff that we have to laboriously get out of the wood again in paper making. How this first wood was made is of course a different question, because the basic chemical substances have not been handed down. What has been preserved to us are the large coal seams that we use for heating and metallurgy, and which also cause hotheads to some contemporaries. The problem back then was that wood was new and no fungus was able to break down wood at the time. As a result, the woods bound enormous amounts of carbon, so that the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere fell significantly. This led to massive cooling and related mass extinctions at the end of the Devonian. The logs piled up were buried, and under the massive pressure of the rocks, the wood became coal. That is why we are talking about fossil fuels that are now consumed within a few generations. The carbon dioxide released is believed to be the main actor for global warming. These first trees were real giants with a height of up to 30 meters. They also began the plant's eternal struggle for the best place in the sun. From now on it was said, grow and rule. But every rule comes to an end, and with the end of the Permian the Lepidodendron trees disappeared, and the Sigiaria trees eke out a sad niche existence until the end of the Mesophytic. The older relatives, to which Asterxylon belonged, and of course the three groups that still exist today, have survived. At the end of the Permian there was great devastation that wiped out 90% of all species. The plants were also badly affected. At the beginning of the Triassic, the vegetation was rather poor. It was now the moment of the simple mosses, but also the club moss family could score again with somewhat larger representatives. But with a height of 2 to 3 meters, Pleuromia was of course tiny compared to the Carboniferous trees. They didn't even survive until the end of the Triassic. The Lycophytes had their first high point during the Carboniferous, which they became a constant level. But during the Permian they increasingly lost their biodiversity. The Mesophytic showed a gradual rise, but at the same time the larger species disappeared. The rapid decline of the Lycophytes began with the Cenophytic. Today most people are hardly familiar with them. The next group that leads to ferns and horsetail cannot be overseen. This is also due to the fact that even today they can reach sizes of over 1 meter. The earliest evidence of horsetail is found in the form of fossil spores. During the Devonian period, they were also recorded in various forms and soon assumed respectable sizes. They reach their peak with tree shapes up to 30 meters high, such as calamites, which grew during the time of the dinosaurs. The Great Age of Horsetail ended in the Jurassic, only today's representatives survived. The horsetails consist of nested elements that have a fractal character. Ferns are closely related to horsetail. They too have a fractal structure, from large to small structures. The first fossil evidence of the ferns can be found in the Devonian, including Hyonia. The Psilotopsida group, which is still species-rich today, became truly species-rich. Numerous ferns also formed tree shapes, but the herbaceous fern bushes were probably always the most important. Like horsetail and all early plants, the fern spreads via spores. The biodiversity of the ferns has increased steadily since their emergence. This development reached its peak at the end of the Mesophytic. From then the biodiversity decreased drastically, with a short revival after the great mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. At that time it was ferns that overgrown the deserted wasteland. But eventually the decline began again during the Tertiary. Horsetail had its heyday in the Paleophytic. Since then the biodiversity has been declining. Opposed to the ferns is a group that is grouped under the Lignophyta. The oldest in tribal history are probably the progymnosperms, which are a kind of forerunners of conifers and seed plants. From the top, the tree-shaped Archaeopteris determined the flora, which is also named after this plant. Of course, it is an unfortunate naming convention, as the name is too similar to that of the ancient bird Archaeopteryx. Despite their initial success, the progymnosperm era terminated at the end of the Permian. Numerous probably paraphyletic groups together make up the term seed ferns. Unlike the earlier ferns, they produced seeds instead of spores. These also appear in the Upper Devonian and become more and more important from the Carboniferous. The medulosids form small, palm-shaped growths, just like the Ligneopteridacea. These disappear at the end of the Paleophytic. The medulosids persist until the end of the Jurassic. The oldest group, the Pteridosperophyta, experienced a sharp decline at the end of the Mesophytic. During the Neogene the group disappeared for good. The progymnosperms had a brief guest appearance in the history of the Earth. After a rapid rise came an equally rapid decline. They led a shadowy existence until the end of the Permian. The seed ferns had their best time in the Paleophytic. Even before the Permian mass extinction, biodiversity collapsed. The population recovers during the Triassic, but then steadily declines until the end of the Mesophytic. The remaining seed plants divided into two groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms stayed true to the original insemination method. A first group of these gymnosperms are the cycadophytes, also known as cycads. In addition to the cycadopsids that still exist today, this group also includes numerous known fossil orders. For example, Glossopteris, a giant tree that got its name because of its tongue-shaped leaves, was significant. This tree dominated the southern Permian continent Gondwana in the form of endless forests. But the Benedictales are particularly well known, those plants that should not be missing in any dinosaur book. Representatives like Psychoidea, Williamsonia or Zamites are really iconic. The group disappears at the end of the Eocene. The peltospermals also produced various palm-shaped plants. They are strongly represented in the Carboniferous and survive until the end of the Mesophytic. The ginkgo plants also belong to the gymnosperm group. The ginkgo tree is only found in China today, but it used to be very common. In addition to the ginkgo trees, herbs such as ephedra also belong to the group, but most of the orders have become extinct. The first ginkgo plants appear already in the Upper Devonian. During the Permian there are first indications of ginkgo trees. The older forms, however, have clearly more articulated leaves than today's representatives. Here we see Archibald compared to some of the plants discussed. The cycads are rather small plants, but Glossopteris and ginkgo are quite respectable trees. If a plant deserves the title living fossil, it is without a doubt Welwitschia in Namibia. This plant belongs to a group that has been identified as nettle since the beginning of the Mesophytic, even if the roots go back to the Devonian. The last group of the gymnosperms is also the best known, of course the conifers. The first seeds have already been proven in the Carboniferous, and at the end of the Carboniferous the Voltziales join the original Curtanthales. The Curtanthales survive into the lower Cretaceous. The Voltziales die out in the middle of the Jurassic. Their sister group, the smaller Corystospermales, even survived into the Paleocene. These first conifers showed the way, but they were soon ousted by the Pinales, the group that makes up all of today's conifers. The oldest groups are the Podocarpus and the Araucarias. They appear already in the Permian. The other conifers, the Shadophytes, the yew and the cypress also developed during the Permian. In addition to thuja and juniper, cypress trees also include the mighty sequoia tree. The Pinaceae appear for the first time in the Triassic. Firs, pines and, a little later, spruce trees shaped the forests of the dinosaur era. The conifers have held up well to this day, and they continue to form forests, especially in colder zones and higher altitudes. The sequoia tree shows that these trees oversize above everything else. Some are so huge that cars can drive through between their roots. But firs, rock areas and spruces also reach a respectable size. The cycads, like the conifers, experienced their first ascent during the Permian. The climax of the cycads occurred in the Middle Triassic. Since then the biodiversity has steadily declined. The peak of the conifers is not reached until the end of the Mesophytic, while there was a gradual decline during the Paleogene, which became more drastic during the Neogene. The best time of the ginkgo plants was during the Jurassic. The remaining group of plants is that of the angiosperms. The name comes from the fact that seeds are hidden in fruit bodies. Various strategies can be pursued with this. On the one hand, the nutrients in the fruit can give the seed a good start. On the other hand, seeds from eaten fruit can often persist the digestive tract and are sown in a remote location with a dose of natural fertilizer. In the beginning, however, these flowers and fruits were just as unavailable as insect pollination. As with the gymnosperms, the wind or maybe the water should judge it. The angiosperms are also called magnolia pites. The oldest fossils that may belong to the group are found in the Upper Devonian. The beginning of the development of fruits is narrated by the Archaefructus, which is difficult to classify. It is probably a sideline to the so-called flowering plants. The oldest known group of flowering plants are the water lilies. These have been detectable since the Lower Cretaceous. The star anise is also far outside. All other plants belong to the monocotyledon or dicotyledonous plants. Who doesn't feel reminded of an early biology lesson at this moment? A subgroup of the monocot is the magnolia family. However, there are also different points of view here, namely that the magnolia family represent an outer group to monocot and dicot. This representation is only one of the different possibilities. When I hear the term magnolias, the first thing that comes to mind is the beautiful tulip tree that stands in the neighbor's garden. Well, fine, as long as its flowers haven't fallen off. Magnolia trees have been documented since the Lower Cretaceous. Myristica, which supplies the nutmegs, also belongs to the magnolia trees. In the kitchen in particular, components of the laurel family are also used. For example, in addition to laurel, the various types of cinnamon belong to this group, but also the avocado tree, which belongs to the persea. Another group of magnolias produces an insecticide that people appreciate very much, pepper. This appears towards the end of the Cretaceous period. Now we come to the monocots. As the name suggests, the main characteristic of these covering plants is the single cotyledon. When we hear the term monocot, we primarily think of grasses, but there is a lot more. An old form of these plants are, for example, the alismates, a series of aquatic plants, which also include seaweed and duckweed. The oldest fossil representatives appear in the Lower Cretaceous. The next group are the lily plants. An important branch also leads to the group of asparagales, the asparagus-like. In addition to asparagus, this group also includes agaves, aloe vera, orchids, leeks, onions and bamboo. Lilies are fossil documented since the Lower Cretaceous. The remaining monocots are grouped together to form the camellinids. On the one hand, a line leads to the various grasses. Grasses first appeared in the Lower Cretaceous. This group is extremely important economically, as all types of grain were grown from grass. Another group are the bromeliads, which live as epiphytes, to which the pineapple also belongs. A sideline of the grass leads to cannon cleaners on the one hand, and to the ginger plants on the other. As a subgroup of grasses, palm trees are known, which have been fossilized since the Triassic. These beautiful tropical plants provide us with coconuts and dates, but also with the rather controversial palm oil. Now we come to the largest and most complex group in the plant world. The sheer complexity makes it impossible to offer more than a superficial insight. Here I just want to show the basic relationships. The oldest group are the Ceratophyllales, to which the hornleaf belongs. The leaves are more reminiscent of conifers and thus underline the original character. Opposed to them are the eudicots, the so-called good dicotyledons. The buttercup family is a first group that has been recorded since the Triassic and is therefore the same age as the dinosaurs. This is followed by the plane trees, the buggeus and the less known gunera. All plants that do not belong to these categories belong to the group of superastrids. The superastrids form two main divisions, on the one hand the astrids, on the other hand the superaricids. This already separates in the Jura into rose plants and various other plants. The delineata have been documented since the Middle Jurassic, including the fig tree, the elm, the mulberry and cannabis. Another group is the Carnation family, which also includes cacti and various carnivorous plants. They have only been proven since the Lower Cretaceous. Many lianas also belong to the Carnation family. The third group is the sandalwood family. The rose family split up into the saxifragales and the uricids, the so-called good rose family. The first group includes the hickory and the walnut tree. The uricids, in turn, split up into the malvids and fabids. The fabids are also known as the bean family, but they are varied and have a lot more to offer than just the beans. In addition to trees such as poplars, a line also leads to wood sorrel. Another line leads to pumpkins, which also includes melons, on one side, and to various well-known trees such as beech, oak, chestnut and birch on the other. Finally, there is another group that leads to beans on the one hand and rose plants on the other. In addition to different types of beans, the fabals also produce trees such as the acacia. The rose plants are very important group, because in addition to roses, they include many cultivated fruit plants such as apples, plums, pears and quinces. Many berries such as strawberries, raspberries and blackberries also belong to the rose family. And don't forget the wine grapes. The rose plants usually appear in the Upper Cretaceous, or in other words, at the beginning of the Cenophytic. At that time, various plants developed flowers, the primary target of which were insects. These were attracted with nectar and in return spread the seeds, thus becoming pollinators. At that time, for example, the bees came up. Even if we consider the flowers to be colorful, the really important signals usually appear in the ultraviolet color spectrum that is perceived by the bees, for example. Since then, plants have no longer left it to chance, wind or water, but animals have used it to spread more efficiently. The other important group of the rose family is the mallow family. They, too, appear with the budding Cenophytic. One group leads to the myrtle family, which includes my beloved eucalyptus tree as well as the myrtle. A sister branch leads to the geraniums, which also include the pelargoniums. The other group now produces the actual mallow, which also includes the lime tree family. In addition to the pistachio tree and maple, the sapindales also include citrus fruits. An important group are the cruciferous vegetables, which not only include mustards but also cabbage species. The last group are the astrids opposed to the superaricids. First, there are lots of rather herbaceous plants, with tree shapes also appearing. The heather plants belong to the second group. The remaining oostrids split into limids and campanulids. The limids include, on the one hand, the ash, which has been detectable since the beginning of the Tertiary. A secondary group are the nightshade family, which includes deadly nightshade, angel's trumpet, potato, tomato, chili plant and tobacco. In addition to nerium and gentian, the gentian plants also include the strychnine containing poison nut and the coffee tree. We see that various toxic substances are produced here, and this is common in the vegetable kingdom. The alkaloids serve as protection against predators, but many of them have become important components of our medicine. Some of these toxins also led to problematic addictive behavior. Now we find a strange plant, the holly. As is now evident, it is not a palm tree. The apials include herbaceous and tree-shaped plants, including the aralia. The best known representative of this group is the carrot. The actual asters are very species-rich, although the fossil evidence is mostly younger than 29 million years. Most of them are herbaceous. The lettuce plants are of economic importance. In addition, there are many beautiful flowers in the family. The rise of the angiosperms, it is clear, took place during the Lower Cretaceous. Remarkably, the point at which they overtook the ferns in biodiversity is also the beginning of the Cenophytic. The rise in angiosperms was accompanied by the decline of ferns and conifers, which were increasingly pushed back by competition. Eventually, most of the other plant orders were pushed into niches. The pollination pact with the insects was to their great advantage. In colder areas, however, this advantage does not exist. The taiga forests are mainly composed of conifers. The climax of the flowering plants was the Eocene climatic optimum. As the climate cooled, biodiversity also declined. After a recovery phase, the next decline followed during the Middle and Late Miocene, at a time when the glaciation of the Antarctic was also beginning. Contrary to old assumptions, the dinosaurs have come to terms with the new plants quite well. After all, flowering plants and dinosaurs flourished together for 35 million years. This can also be seen in their living descendants, the birds, which get along very well with the flora. Major changes occurred later when the grasses came up. These led to new landscapes, open steppes, which became important for the development of many ungulates. There were different strategies to cope with the difficult-to-digest grass food. Horses developed massive dentition, while some articulated ungulates developed complex digestive systems and rumination. The importance of plants should not be underestimated. They are an important climate factor and convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar. What else they need, they take from their roots in the ground, which is itself also a work of plants and fungi, or in the case of carnivorous plants, of animals. What they mainly need is the energy of sunlight for photosynthesis, but also a constant supply of water. Nonetheless, there are also adaptations for harsher conditions, such as the various succulents and sour grasses. Plants fight each other for the best place in the sun, but they can be brutal with each other. In order to defend themselves against enemies, they have developed a rich arsenal of alkaloids, terpenes and other substances, and spines and thorns are also said to keep predators away. And despite all these facts, they are not perceived by many as living beings, they are simply part of the landscape. And above all, they serve the economy, be it in the form of food, cosmetics, medicines, cut flowers or wood. Many complain about the steak on the plate, while they don't mind that a tree had to die for the table on which this plate stands. Plants, animals and fungi have a common origin. They are all living beings, and we should show the same respect for all forms of life. Thank you for watching. Stay fluffy.
Dear friends, I hope you are well. How you see my hunt for the dangerous monster continues. I got hints that it is hidden on a volcano island. See ya soon.